Thanks for your beautiful welcome and for all of the years we've collectively been able to enjoy, the benefits of living in this beautiful country. And, one of the beautiful things about a lot of the people here is that I think at least we've been able to hear some sort of voice from country which has helped propel us to say, gee, we need to save those forests, we need to stop that land being fracked. It is beautiful to sometimes look out and go, well, we heard some voice and we did something about it, and we've protected it from something. Okay, and to me, I think in so many ways it's that protection of country and that protection of the environment, which is always my first love. Somehow more recently I've come around, to also being active for the humans and the housing and so on, and that's probably because, there's the environment and there's justice, and, they're just two things that, if you've really got a switched on soul and your eyes are open, you can't resist either of those. So that's how we're here. Thank you. All right, I think I've got to introduce the speakers, but I'll do that at the end, and I'll just have a little bit of a chat, sort of framing our discussion for today. Really this housing crisis that we live in is it's a horrifying thing. It's an intergenerational crime, for one thing. I think it's very sad how much it's really splitting the generations. Young people really feeling ripped off by it, and rightly so. And so it's sort of interesting to sort of think, how did we get here? And it's sort of fitting when we're thinking about Aquarius and thinking about the 70s to think about the kind of society we had then. And sort of sadly, capitalism is always the problem that it is. Democracy is the attempt to do something about it that it is. And perhaps in the 70s we got perhaps as close as we got to at least sort of regulating capitalism in a mildly redistributive way, particularly by the time we got to the Whitlam government. But even before that, the wartime and post-war governments of Curtin and Chifley, the establishment of things like the Housing Commission. When I grew up as a kid, in the 70s, Housing Commission was a massive thing. Well, at least it was for me. My family lived nearby. We were working class, but not in Housing Commission. But I went to school, and most of the school kids I knew were in Housing Commission. It covered vast amounts of every city, and I think we're all aware of it. Sometimes it was sometimes seen as a slightly derogatory term, but we look on it now and go, wow, it's not that. It's not that at all. It's what society should have been doing. And, even for 23 years of Liberal government in those days, it was still maintained as a very strong policy. So how did we get to where we are? And, and I think that's the horror, really, that we went from the idea that government is there to tax the rich and spend to provide the goods for society, and housing sort of being one of those absolute ones, absolutely foundational ones, to the degraded society we're in now. I use the term the dismal tide of neoliberalism, because I really think that's where it is. It's an absolutely dismal tide. As someone employed at the university with an actual reasonable wage, every time John Howard and his following cronies would give out those ridiculous pre-election tax cuts, I'd always just despair, going, look, I don't want $10 more a week, I want a fair society, But it goes beyond that. Even the entire tax system only taxes people who actually exert themselves and work. It doesn't tax people sufficiently who sit in their arse and just collect the money. Landlords in Australia pay net negative tax, which is just absolutely appalling. With all of the rorts, the negative gearing and the capital gains tax rorts and so on that were again set up by the Howard government mostly. They pay net negative tax, so they're actually withdrawing from the tax system whilst cashing in on it. It's that's where I really see the problem. So much of the problem is just that system, and it was, it was set up open-eyed as an intergenerational bribe. I remember watching an intergenerational report came out way back in, the early part of the new century or the late 90s, and the government was so aware of the problem of the ageing population, and yet at the same time were bribing them with all of these rorts and so on for property, just to keep the Liberal Party in power. And it's and we all know it's not as though the Labor Party's faultless with all of this, but I guess they did run an anti-negative gearing policy to an election and lost it, so they've lost their nerve a bit on that. So one of the themes that really frames the housing crisis, as bad as it's got, is that idea of just this dismal tide of neoliberalism and the awful way in which homes have become just commodities and assets rather than homes. And another way we really see that, and it's, and it's visual, is all homes in Australia nowadays are white on the inside. That's just about it. Colour has been absolutely drained, and there's one reason why all interior decorating has gone white, because nobody thinks this is well, they might around here, but very few people in the cities, for example, think this is my family home forever and we're going to do it up the way we want. Nearly everybody's like, oh, it's an asset, we've got to paint it in neutral colours, so it's going to have a good resale value. And so people have observed, there's actually, and it's almost symbolic, this idea that we've so lost the concept of what a home is spiritually and emotionally and turned it into an asset that we can't even paint it. We can't even let our kids paint their wall ghastly purple, right? Which is they're always wanting to do, So, we can't even have that incredibly personalised tile mosaic in our kitchen because, oh my good, the purchasers might not like it. So it's become awful. But I think that's one thing. And in terms of that intergenerational crime, it's just awful what young people are facing. I remember once, I was only in high school, I don't know why these things were in my mind, but using the silly idea of the stork bringing babies, I remember just drawing this little cartoon when I was about 15 of the planet, so I must have seen the photos from space, and the stork coming in with a new baby and just a little sign poking out of the North Pole that just says, keep off private property. Because private property's never really made sense on this planet, actually. We take it so for granted. But what does it really mean? It really is an insult to every new baby born. It says, welcome to the planet, now go to work and try and buy a bit of it. And you never really get to buy a bit of it. You buy a bit of it, you mortgage it to the bank, and then these days people end up remortgaging it back to the exploitative aged care industry because their families aren't looking after them, and it's awful. So that's one whole side of it, that dismal tide of neoliberalism that's broken our lives up. So if one thing I think we can begin to do inside ourselves is that emotional and spiritual change where we start to look at homes differently, look at families differently, and look at our lives differently, and not be infected by that ideology of dismal neoliberalism. The second really big one, I think, that really enforces the homelessness problem is the complexity of the planning system. And it's really, and it's coupled to the first one, I think, because it's really saddening that we move more and more and more towards this planning system in which houses have to be done up like wedding cakes with their smoke alarms and this and that and planning standards, and it's, people don't build new homes because it's just too hard. I mean, I'm lucky to have, owned and built one out at Kyogle, and they sent me the occupation certificate in the mail without ever sending around a building inspector, And that was in 2004, but that's Kyogle. But these things, it's like a noose that tightens and tightens and tightens and tightens, and nobody, it's just too hard to go ahead and build houses unless you don't tell anyone that you're doing it. And I think there's something awful there too, because it's a two-stage process where on the one hand we've got this bureaucratic and collective vision of housing standards and how incredible, how just the first world housing standard that you have to reach and all of the regulations you have to get through. And then on the other hand, the fact that they're just absolutely unaffordable and people can't get them, they can't rent them, they can't build them, they can't make any. And so I kind of see that, we've got to, as a society, we either, if we want to have housing standards that high, then we would need to invest in building houses like the Housing Commission did all those years ago that make that accessible to people at that standard. But if we're going to say, what I say is the planning system's really become a gatekeeper. It's like a gated suburb. If you can afford the massive rental or if you can afford the massive mortgage, you can go into the gated community of these supposedly safe homes. They're built of garbage materials anyway, but leave that aside. And the rest of you are somehow scrabbling around, being told that told it's your fault, being told that you should be ashamed, you should be invisible, as they do to the homeless. And so it just becomes this two-part society, whereas, I mean, I've lived in Vanuatu, you go to other societies that actually don't have the same supposed on-paper standard of living, but at least they don't make it illegal to be poor. At least they don't make it illegal to build a shack and live in it. Because, I think what everybody who's lived in the hills and built their own shack knows is that you find dignity, you find joy in every day living in a 1 or 2 room shack with a garden out the back of it that you've built yourself that you can live in. Whereas you don't find joy sitting on a rental list, sitting on a public housing list, waiting for the government to finally find you some, scummy little flat that apparently has running water and electricity. You'd be much happier lighting up your chip heater and sitting in your bath under the stars than doing that. And I think that's, again, something that we've proven around here. So yeah, they're the things I see as a real problem, and that's why this region, that's why the Aquarian history and the multiple occupancy history has been so absolutely important, because it actually turned around and said, no, we're going to actually enable that. We're going to allow people to move out in the hills. We're going to enable them to break down the individualism of neoliberal society and cooperate with each other and buy land collectively. We're going to enable them to build their own unique houses, which are small, which don't necessarily have mains power, which don't have all those things. I mean, personally, I lived for 9 years, I think, without refrigeration or hot water, but I'd never do it again. If I ever start again, it's roof, water tank, hot water system, and then we can build the rest of it. But you can't try to build all day and then not have a hot bath to sit in. But anyway, that's just me getting old. So, we've really done that. And I think one of the really big themes that made that all possible, and it's the theme I always come back to in these situations, is it wasn't done by going cap in hand and asking for permission to do it. That's not how it happened, and that's never how it happens. Communities bring about change, particularly in relation to housing and planning issues, not by seeking permission, but by going ahead and doing it anyway, and then turning around to the government saying, well, it's already there, you're not going to bulldoze it, are you? And sometimes they do, but often they back down and don't do the bulldozing. So the underlying, most lawyers know this, it's a common refrain of lawyers, but it's always worked locally and for this movement, is that it really is better to beg forgiveness later than to seek permission first. Because, and I knew that as a kid with my parents, let alone dealing with the ridiculous planning system that we have and the ridiculous councils. So I think that's been one of the great things, and that's one of the great answers. So as we go forward and listen to both the history and the forward-looking proposals, whether it's land share communities, multiple occupancies, tiny homes, van lifing facilities, or indeed squatting. Don't mention the word. These are the ways we go forward, and we seek forgiveness rather than permission. And it's interesting. Just today is actually the 1-year anniversary of when the Pine Street squatters actually let the world. They were actually there a bit before that, but let the world know. So it's interesting. And I'll just finish up on talking about that. One of the cruelest things about homelessness in this society is we expect and demand that the homeless are invisible. We demand that they're silent. We demand that they hide, and we even effectively demand that they're ashamed of themselves. And what Pine Street did differently was said, we're here, we're proud, we're doing good things, we're protecting the houses, we're helping other homeless people, and it's a positive thing. And for a while, they seemed to be tolerated, but effectively the right wing saw that as an absolute poke in the eye. How dare you be homeless, how dare you be proud, and how dare you say you're doing something positive. But despite all of the fascist bullying, despite all of the sock puppets, right-wing sock puppets on social media, despite Chris Minns enacting his fantasy of driving his bulldozer and bulldozing houses and so on, despite the ridiculous demolitions, it's very interesting. And despite the Supreme Court decision this week, it's at least something I think owe some honouring to the Pine Street squatters to have actually been there for a year. That's actually quite an achievement. They're still there, we still don't know the answer, and they're not the last ones. As we know, if you create a housing crisis and a whole lot of empty houses, you are always going to get squatting. There was already squatting all over the Northern Rivers and Lismore. There still is, there still will be. Just next door to me, I've got the Joy Love Art Gallery with Jimmy Willing, which is a new, beautiful, again, positive, honest, open, constructive face for squatting, so we'll have to see how the powers deal with that one. It's interesting, I mean, for all of their hard work to go into the Supreme Court, spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on lawyers, they've really achieved very little other than, you know, proving what we already knew, that the legal system will back the owner over the squatter. But they've still got the same job they had of trying to get people out, and even if they get them out of the houses they're targeting, they're going to be in other houses anyway. They haven't solved the problem, and the other problem we have is their desire to demolish perfectly good houses. They seem to have paused that, but we've got to keep the pressure on that one. Okay, thanks everyone. I just need to get my piece of paper out now. The rest of that I just made up on the spot, obviously. What's that? Oh, I have. I'm not even over time. Well done. Okay. Well, again, thanks to Mark for the welcome. Much appreciated. So next we've got, of course, Carol Perry coming up. Not yet. I'm just configuring the people. So we've got Carol Perry. Carol Perry, what's going wrong? I don't usually have this problem. With the talk, Creating Involvement, Harmony and Continuum in Community, and I do look forward to that. I remember at the SCU conference, you know, there was all the sort of the heady stuff, and then Carol was just such a wonderful kind of feminine perspective in there that just said, yes, but you've got to get along as well. And that's really important, and I think that's something we all learnt so much with MOs, is you can set up a structure, but then you've got to stop tearing each other apart. Which is a really big journey for white Western people, I think, to try and relearn those tribal skills. And then, again, one of my favourite women of the area, Gay Longmuir, shared with Megan James from Tuntable Falls Cooperative, Living Your Truth and Standing Up for Change, which I look forward to seeing. And finally, Rob Doolan, who I just met, who's had a very long history. I think from what I hear chatting to him, that seeking forgiveness rather than permission stage of the multiple occupancy movement, working with government after the event, after people were already there and saying, all right, well, you're going to have to find a way to allow us to keep being here. So thanks very much for all that work over the years as well. So there are our three people, so I'll hand it over to Carol to get started.